History is an interesting study. In school, I had little or no time for history. Then it happened in my high school senior year that a professor that was also the principal taught a history class in American history, and I found it interesting because he brought to the surface many things relating to religion that I did not know occurred. In college, in Ozark Bible College, as was located in Bentonville, Arkansas, the teacher of the church history class moved and took a position with the church, and they said, "Burton, you teach this class." I was ill-equipped in history. I had not taken church history at that point. The class was only about 4 weeks old, and it was a struggle for me. I determined then that I would study history to the best of my ability to at least understand what has occurred. Let me give you a little outline that may help you. There are two ways of looking at history. If we look at history as world history, there are three departments: ancient, medieval, and modern. Now, ancient history, as we sometimes think of it, goes past the coming of Christ. But really, we are studying a period in which Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Roman figured the prominent part. After Christ came, introduced us to a new era of history. That is, of course, sometimes listed as medieval. Literally, the medieval period begins with the fall of Rome, 476, and it lasts to the discovery of America, 1492. Let's call it 1500. So from about 500 to 1500, we have a period indicated on the chart as the Dark Ages. At the end of the Dark Ages, there appeared a new movement in religion, no longer the structure of the Dark Ages known as Catholicism, Roman and Greek Catholicism. But now it is called Protestantism because certain groups of people protested many of the teachings and the practices of the Catholic Church. Among the Protestants, of course, we have many branches. The word Reformation is often used. Not only Reformation, but action and reaction among people, so that various splinter groups came because either outright they objected to the teaching, or else later among themselves they disagreed with others who disagreed with Catholicism. And we have a total of hundreds of different churches in the past 400 years. We will be talking later in this series about the various Protestant groups. Suffice it to say, these guidelines that we give to you will help you. This chart is a color-coded chart. It is a chart that has certain relationships. First, we have the yellow that is at the top, represents the church of the Bible. Whatever this church was called, whatever this church believed, whatever this church was told to do is represented by this gold band at the top. I find in teaching people this becomes very important because I do not have to defend any doctrine. I do not have to defend any organization. I simply say whatever Jesus taught about the church is represented at that point in history. Now we know from the Bible that there was to be a great departure, and there was. We spend our time tonight on this point. But before we do, this departure was chiefly in the Western world. That is, in Europe, centered in Rome of Italy. It did not begin there. If you'll notice, the chart begins, indicated by the blue, in the middle of the century. Let's say when 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written, about 52 or 53. And the dissensions and the differences that existed at that time and indicated would continue to exist caused a great split in the eastern part of the empire. Now, this empire was composed basically of the Greek culture. Now, the Greek culture was an imaginative culture. They were able to produce great works of art, of poetry, of music, sculpture. And of course, as historians say, the Greeks were always boys and the Romans were always men. By this I mean to say that the Greeks had great imaginations, and they liked to play house. They liked to imagine what they could paint or the poetry could describe, but in time of war they were not so proficient. The Romans were strong, decisive, militant, and they put together an empire such as the world had never seen, nor has ever seen since. Including the Holy Roman Empire, it lasted something like 1,800 years. That's a long time for the Roman Empire. If you consider that this Western Empire included most of the people that are called Christians, which you can see by this map, illustrated, for instance, the early churches were established in Palestine and in Asia Minor, chiefly, stretching as far as Greece and even as far as Rome, but not too many churches in the 1st century. By the 2nd century, they had spread in what is called the Western world, so that what we call the Eastern world did not compare with the Western world by way of numbers of Christians or churches. Now, the splinters that took place in the Eastern Empire fragmented the thinking of chiefly the Eastern world. It was the occasion of several of the councils held, these called the 7 ecumenical councils, or the 7 general councils, engaged by the bishops of the Eastern Church or the Greek Church and the bishops of the Western Church or the Roman Church. They had other problems, of course, but these controversies and some of the doctrines they taught were the center of attention. Down through history, there were additional councils, you will notice, and these took place in the Western world, because later on the Eastern Church or the Greek Orthodox Church became more like the Bible than the Western Church did. But it was a growing mass of structure, sprawling out across thousands and thousands of acres and miles, including hundreds and thousands of churches. Just stop and think at this period of time. Gibbon the historian has estimated in his writings that there were approximately 10% of the people of the Roman Empire that were Christians in about 300. 10%. That's when Constantine gave freedom to the Christians from persecution. Other archaeological discoveries, however, have come up with something even larger than that, something like perhaps 50% of the people in the Roman Empire by the 4th and 5th centuries had embraced Christianity. Now you understand, we're not saying they were all Christians and they were all saved, but they professed not the pagan religions, but the Christian religion. So it made tremendous advances. And so this represents the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. These little dots that show you where they had clusters or groups of churches. Of course, the Western world began a struggle. The struggle is indicated by a list to my right. These are doctrines that many people advocated, some accepted, but by and large the Roman Catholic Church rejected these, but as time passed they accepted these. I have placed the dates on these as nearly as possible according to the dates established by the Catholic Church. One good book that will help you is called The Question Box. It is a Catholic book that is published for the benefit of Protestants, so they can understand what the Catholics believe and why. And they give the dates when officially these doctrines were accepted. Approximately 80 to 85% of these doctrines originated from paganism. In other words, they simply borrowed them from the pagan Roman Empire, and these were absorbed by them, became their doctrines, and finally their practices. Of course, this brought on controversy because everyone was not pleased to accept these doctrines. So you see the councils that are marked off in green, and of course it culminated in the council that is known as Trent. And it is a great council because they completely restructured everything. It wasn't the last one. They had another one over 100 years ago, and it was not the last one. They have finished another one since then. But nevertheless, the basic structure was settled about 500 years ago. There have not been too many changes since then. But, of course, more people objected to Catholicism. You'll see that indicated by these orange spurs, the Albigensians, the Waldensians, and the Hussites, as groups objected to the teaching of the Catholic Church, and there was nothing to do but to defect from the Catholic Church. The Albigensians, of course, were annihilated. The Waldensians did a little better. In fact, they claim that there are probably more Waldensians in northern Italy than there are Roman Catholics. If you doubt that the Catholic Church has always had peace, just read your newspapers. You will see that the power struggle that has always existed still exists in the Catholic Church. So that now there is a threat on the part of the liberals maybe to try to split the Catholic Church wide open. That may happen, it may not happen. There have been splits before. The main division came in 1054 when the Greek Catholic Church finally broke from the Roman Catholic Church. You notice prior to this they had some serious differences, 4 of them. The 5th one, they said, is permanent. And they had thus established 2 different groups of churches. One centered in Constantinople, and his title was Patriarch. The other being in Rome, and the title was Pope, which means Papa. Tonight, what we wish to give you chiefly is entitled Pre-Written History. I make this clear to people as I teach them in their homes that what you see in front of your eyes is not something that just happened. Number one, there is a power that caused it to happen. That power is superhuman. That power has intelligence. That power can plan and execute his plans. Satan himself. But number 2, the things which you see happen in the past 2,000 years were predicted by Christ that they would happen. We have not made an exhaustive list of the Scriptures, but let's just give notice to some of these. The Bible teaches that there would be other Christs. Jesus came into the world, and he was called the Christ. Thou art my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. He said to Jesus' disciples, hear him. This Jesus, then later, was called Christ because it means anointed one. In Matthew chapter 16, Peter and the apostles were looking admiringly to the great city in Caesarea Philippi, and it was built upon a large rock. Soldiers had never been able to scale it and the walls and enter the city. And Jesus said, I have something a little more important to say. It's not what Jeremiah or Isaiah or John the Baptist, any of the prophets said. Upon this rock I will build my church. Now it asked Peter, whom do men say that I am? They said, one of the prophets. Isaiah or Jeremiah or John the Baptist. So Jesus said, okay, that's what men say. What do you say? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus said, upon this I will build my church. Now your name is Peter. You're a little pebble. But upon this rock, this big boulder, I'll build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. But the devil's plan always calls for substitutes. So there would be many false Christs. Reading in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 18, ye have heard that Antichrist shall come. You realize there is no place in the Bible that teaches us that there is a one singular Antichrist that is coming sometime in the future? You ask people to give the scripture. Notice what he says. You have heard that anti, meaning opposed to Christ, will come. Even now, there already are many antichrists. What he says. Not one, but many. There be many antichrists, whereby ye know that it is the last time. This was spoken less than 100 A.D. Let's say that First John was written in maybe 90 A.D. Some give a little earlier date. But when he wrote this, John was not dead yet. The book of Revelation had not been written yet. And yet he is telling us that already there are many antichrists. Already he is saying, now that you know this is the last time, we're in the last dispensation. Then again he said, many deceivers are entered into the world, who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is Antichrist. You notice that written in 2 John verse 7. He tells us that there were some who would teach the doctrine that Jesus Christ had not come in the flesh. In about 360, a man by the name of Apollinarius, and this is called what's the Apollinarianism, the doctrine that Jesus did not come in human form. Now let me just pause a moment to tell you this didn't happen to be the first time it was taught, because by this time in history, many of the teachers were placing more emphasis upon Plato than upon Peter, placing more emphasis upon Aristotle than they were the Apostle Paul. As we move down through history, all the way to the heart of the Dark Ages, you notice that old Greek cultures, their beliefs, their philosophies were gradually embraced into the Catholic Church. Now in the Dark Ages, they had what's called the schoolmen. The schoolmen were the scholars that set up the framework that later became the adopted beliefs of the Catholic Church. Well, they debated such questions as how many angels could dance on the head of a simple pinpoint. Very, very profitable doctrines that they discussed. And of course, they borrowed heavily from the Greek philosophers. At that point in history, the proof of their doctrine more than likely would be either Plato or Aristotle, so it was called Aristotelianism or Platonism. They did not give serious credence to the Scriptures. Even at this point, they gave more importance to the teaching of the Greek philosophers. So naturally, they'd come up with the doctrine that Jesus did not appear in the flesh. He just looked like he appeared. He was an apparition. That Jesus was spirit, and as they looked at him, like, say, Christian scientists teach, that as matter, he did not exist. He's talking about these people in this scripture. He said the people that deny that Jesus came in the flesh is Antichrist. He said he is a deceiver and Antichrist. That's 2 John 7, as I told you a moment ago. I suppose he's alluding to Matthew 24:24. Now, Jesus was referring chiefly to the fall of Jerusalem, but he's telling us that in that period of time there would arise many false Christs and false prophets. And of course, history tells us that approximately 50 men arose saying, I am the Messiah, I am Christ. Now the Jews, according to Daniel chapter 9 and the vision given to Daniel, looked forward to the coming of the Messiah, and they knew exactly when he would come, historically, chronologically. He came all right, but they rejected him. So they looked for another. Jesus said one time, do you look for another? The apostle said, we can't look for another. We believe that you're the Christ. So the masses crucified Jesus. Earlier in John 6, 5,000 left him, and it says, walk no more with him. And he said to his disciples, will you also go? They said, to whom shall we go? Peter said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So they adhered closely to Jesus, but the Jews realized there was to be a Messiah coming that period of time. And the opportunists said, I am Christ. So Jesus said in Matthew 24:24, many shall rise and say, I am Christ. Or they would say, lo, there is Christ. Here is Christ. He said there would rise false Christs and false prophets. In 1 John chapter 2, we read verse 18 a moment ago. Look at verse 22. Let's add this on top of it. Who is a liar but he that denieth that Jesus is the Christ? Now you see, that takes in some other controversies that we have, such as the Arian controversy and others. Some denied that Jesus came in the flesh. Others denied that Jesus was the eternal Son of God. So to deny the humanity of Jesus or the deity of Jesus means that you are a liar, or I am a liar. He pulls no punches. He asks, who is a liar but he that denieth that Jesus is Christ? He is Antichrist, he that denieth the Father and the Son. Now that existed in the days of the apostles. That is not yet in the future. There will continue to be Antichrist, but the nature is not that a world ruler politically will set up a kingdom and rule over the Jews, or rather the Jews will rule with him. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't indicate that. It means that they have denied that Jesus is either divine or that he is human. The Bible doesn't stop here. He said many false prophets, you remember? Many false prophets are gone out into the world. Hereby know ye the Spirit of God. I'm reading from 1 John 4. He's saying the same thing he did in chapter 2. Every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God, and every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And this is that spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come. They had heard in the years before this that Antichrist spirit would come. Now he says, and even now is already in the world. 1900 years ago. It's not in the future. It started in the past. Not one Antichrist, but he said many Antichrists. Not will come, but already in the world. Now that's what Matthew 24:24 said, wasn't it? And that is, there would rise false Christs and false prophets. And he calls these prophets. Try the spirits and see whether they be of God. But the good book tells us there would be false apostles too. You see, when Jesus stood there at the foot of Caesarea Philippi, he said, now, upon this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. But he counted on the apostles. So he told them in Matthew chapter 10, he said in 34 and 35 that the time is going to come when they will deliver you up before the rulers. Take no thought what ye shall say, it shall be given you in the same hour. The apostles were only crude fishermen or businessmen or tax gatherers. Jesus said the Spirit will tell you. And of course in John chapter 14, 16, 17, 26, chapter 15, 26, and 16, 7 through 14, other places, Jesus gave a promise to the apostles. He said, I have many things to say unto you, can't receive them now. Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he'll guide you into all truth. So the apostles would know the truth. Now he said, I'm going away. And he said, if I go away, I will send the Comforter, which is the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name. He shall teach you all things. So the apostles on the day of Pentecost received the Holy Spirit, came upon them, enabling them to preach what they didn't know previously, what they had not understood, and everything was in the hands, the well-keeping of the apostles, and the church was established. And under their direction and regulation, churches in many areas grew to great strength. You know, they tell us as time passed that Ephesus had something like 200,000 Christians in it at one time. I want you to think of what that means. Half of the city composed of the church. Zealous, evangelistic. The church was established. But now, as the New Testament period is brought to a close, as these inspired apostles had written the books and closed out the record and handed the good book to the generations that would follow, there would be false teachers, apostles even, false apostles. This he tells us in 2 Corinthians 11, 13 and 14. Such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves as the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed as an angel of light. So Satan uses men to call them apostles, but they are only false apostles. In giving John the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 2, tells us that church at Ephesus had some good qualities, 5 great qualities. Before he told them they had some shortcomings. One of these was, thou hast tried them which say they're apostles and are not, and hast found them liars. They're deceitful workers. They're liars. They're not true apostles. And so people would gravitate to these false apostles, like they did away from Jesus. And you could expect that there would be, as well as the true church, there would be a false church. In fact, as he writes to these 7 churches of Asia in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation, he tells about these false doctrines. He calls it the synagogue of Satan. That is the meeting place of Satan. As soon as God does something, it's right, it's true. Satan follows by the counterfeit, by the false. He uses deceptive means. He is a liar. As well as having false apostles, he likewise gave an abundance of false teachers. Now, as these nights follow, you'll see many of these teachers by name, what they taught, the effect it had upon the church. What I read in the good book, it says, "But there were false prophets among the people." Now, this is Peter writing, and he's talking about what happened in the past, the Old Testament dispensation. "As there were false prophets among the people, even shall there be false teachers among you, who privately shall bring in damnable heresies, even denying the Lord that bought them," which is the heart of many of these beginning cults or sects, groups splintering off from the church, starting first in the east, which is Asia Minor and Palestine, even reaching over into Rome. He says these are false apostles. These are deceitful workers. They are teachers that lead astray. And these that will rise will have swift destruction. And many shall follow their pernicious ways. You know what pernicious means? Maybe you will if I remind you of what pernicious anemia is. Now, I don't think I have pernicious anemia, but I have seen people that have it, and they just kind of waste away to nothing. They have no energy, they have no interest, they have no direction. They can't seem to keep things going the way they should. Physically, they've had it. Many shall follow their deadening ways, pernicious ways, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evilly spoken of. Now, the false teacher will deny the truth. The false teacher will say, "Don't believe that." He will say, "You believe me." These men existed in the days of the New Testament, and he said they would also exist in later ages. And then he adds, "Shall they make merchandise of you?" Make merchandise. In Galatians chapter 6, Paul mentions this. He said, "Neither are those who teach you to be circumcised," he said, "neither are they circumcised or doing the thing that they're teaching or trying to get other people to do." What is their interest then? He said, "For their sakes." They are seeking disciples to support them. They're seeking followers, either by greed or the desire for popularity. They gather about them people. They have followers. They gave Paul trouble everywhere he went. Read the epistles and see if that is not so. Read 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Read the book of Jude and see if it is not so. I've just read from 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. This sounds like Acts chapter 20, verse 30, doesn't it? When Paul is speaking to the elders of the church at Ephesus, "Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, and draw away disciples after themselves." Now, that was considerably before the book of Revelation was written, but I just quoted to you in Revelation chapter 2, verse 2, how that Jesus commended them because they tried those that call themselves apostles and are not. Now, in this Acts chapter 20, he points out two things. Among yourselves they will arise, drawing away disciples. They will come on also, he said, as grievous wolves, not sparing the flock. You can expect something like this to happen, because this is history pre-written. He is telling what Satan will do as he builds this monstrous and malignant kingdom to destroy truth and Christ, if possible. But Jesus said the church will stand. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. But don't ever underestimate the power of Satan, though he may know he's a loser. Revelation 12 says he hath great wrath, knowing that his time is short. He knows he's a loser, but he hath great wrath, and he does all the damage each year that he can do. But the good book tells us there would be a departing from the faith. So in the designing of this chart, we indicated a wedge that was driven, splintering off some of the people in the eastern areas, chiefly among the Jews, and later on among the Gentile congregations, chiefly because they were influenced by the Greek cultures, and so they gathered about them their heroes in the church, and it caused difficulties in the days of the apostles. He tells us about this in these words. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly. That means the Spirit conveys to your mind the real truth. Now expressly is like you receiving from the express department, agency, parcel. Now, I don't know if they do it nowadays. They probably don't, but I can remember the time when they had express delivery all over the towns. So when something was sent by express, it didn't simply come to a building. It was loaded into a car, a vehicle, and delivered to your door. That's what the word express means. It means to get the idea across. The Spirit speaketh plainly and conveys to your mind that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith. Depart from the faith. They did. Giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils or demons, having their conscience seared with a hot iron. You know what that is like, to have your conscience seared with a hot iron? It means that you don't have any feeling anymore. It's burned out. You can do that. I used an illustration a time or two of seeing that about the third year I was preaching. I was conducting a revival meeting in a town, and I happened to go down by the town square, and I saw a crowd gathered, and I thought, well, what could it be? And of course, the man was hawking his wares. He had little containers, probably a half-inch high and 2.5 inches in diameter, and it had salve in it. He was selling for 25 cents. Now, that's back when 25 cents could buy something, because that was before World War II. And so he had a man in a straitjacket, and he put the man in a straitjacket so he couldn't get out, presumably, and he was going to work his way out of that. Of course, that's the attention getter, and everybody came to see him wiggling around trying to get out of the straitjacket, and by the way, he did. He puffed himself up like a toad when it was put on him, and began to shrink down like this, and just wiggled his way out. But in the meantime, he had one of these old-fashioned gasoline torches, and that old blue flame was a-hissing out, and he put an old-fashioned soldering iron this big around right in front of the flame. And after a while, that became so hot that it was red hot. So he picked that up and he said, I want to show you something. He rammed it through a board. It just burned a hole in it. Now he said, let me show you something else. He held up his hand and he passed that soldering iron across just like this. You could see the smoke and smell the skin. But quickly he reached down out of one of those little containers and got some of the salve and rubbed over his hand. And then he stuck some in his ear. And he said, see, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. Look at my hand. Boy, they bought it like crazy. Seared with a hot iron. Do you mean to tell me that that man went through that pain to do that? He'd done that so many times, he probably had skin 1/4 inch thick. It's like passing it over an elephant's skin. No pain. He couldn't feel anything. There comes a time when men have no love for the truth. They follow the devil's pernicious ways, the deadly ways, the misleading ways, the deceivers, the liars. And somehow in all of this, they have their conscience seared with a hot iron. And they teach some of these doctrines we'll be looking at, saying that you shouldn't marry and you shouldn't eat meat. Now, these were vegetarians. Later on, it was accepted into the Catholic Church in the form of not eating fish on Friday and priesthood not marrying. He's projecting our minds to a time when he said, in the latter days there will be a departure from the faith. He names some of these teachings that would be brought forth. That is 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. But the good book tells us that a new gospel would be preached too. Now, let me illustrate this in Galatians 1:6. I marvel that ye are so quickly removed from him that called you unto the grace of Christ unto another gospel. But he clears the minds of the Galatians up by saying, which is not another. It's not another gospel. There's only one. But there be some that would pervert the gospel of Christ. Now at that point, some of the Galatians had been introduced to another gospel. Gospel means good news. In this case, it was bad news. But the teachers called it good news. Good news, like the Garden of Eden. The devil said, you don't have to depend on God. It's the introduction of humanism. It's a help yourself. It's a do-it-yourself program. You see it every day. We've seen for the past almost 6,000 years that the devil says, do your own thing. And then if you get in trouble, you'll have knowledge of God to know good from evil. Then you can correct it. So the world is full of do-it-yourself and help-yourself schemes and gimmicks. Now we saw this later on as this new gospel was introduced. They didn't want them to depend upon the gospel of Christ, the grace of Christ. So they introduced a new gospel and said, I've got good news for you. You eat of this, you'll have knowledge of God to know good from evil. But Paul said, it's not another gospel. Later on he wrote, I fear lest by any means, he said to the Corinthians, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity or purity of Christ. And he says that if he that cometh preacheth another gospel, now he's going to enter into a little sarcasm here, but he says, if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom ye have not preached, if ye receive another spirit, which ye have not received, or another gospel, which ye have not accepted, ye might well bear with him, he says in sarcasm. In this 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he's alluding to the false teachers. Now, if you doubt that, just remember a little earlier, we gave you verses 13 and 14. Just drop right down. And he's telling you about the false prophets, about the false teachers that would arise. And that's what he's alluding to here. Now, he said, if they really taught you another Jesus, a better Jesus, a better gospel, you might bear with them. But he said, listen, he won't introduce a better one. It will be a substitute. It'll be a phony. This man will be a liar and a deceiver. You see what the gospel, what the devil does is if people, he doesn't want people to accept the real Christ, he offers them another Christ, or the real gospel, a substitute. Now that's why people knock on your doors, and instead of trying to give you a simple Bible to read, they're giving you literature. Now, some things in the literature will be good, but the average person is in no position to handle this. No man can possibly handle deceptive teaching, false doctrines, who does not himself know and understand the true doctrine. Now, I tell people so often, I tell them like often, we've had some wonderful conversions there of people that have been steeped in false teaching. And I tell them frequently that what you want to do, if you don't want to be cumbered with false teaching or possibly be deceived, just limit yourself to the good book and study it and read it. As that truth comes clear through to you, you will be in position then to see what is wrong with this writing, that doctrine. But this becomes the rule. This becomes the guide. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says, let no man deceive you by any means. Now, I said verse 4, it's chapter 2, it's beginning with verse 4. That let no man deceive you by any means. What is he talking about? I want us tonight, if you will, to skip through the first few verses of this, because he's alluding to the second coming of Christ. And then he tells us something would happen before Jesus comes again. The two monumental events, Jesus' first coming and his second coming, have cradled within them the great gospel dispensation, he says. Now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together unto him, that ye be not soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, because there were those that said Jesus has already come. Now, Jesus said, John 14, I go away, I'll come again. That's what I told my wife when I left. I'll go again. I'll come again. He said, don't be shaken in mind, either by word as from us, nor by letters as from us, that the day of Christ is at hand. Well, when would Jesus come again? Not before certain things happened. We'll be talking about these in the following nights. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first. A falling away first. And that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitting in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Remember ye not that when I was yet with you, I told you these things? And now ye know what withholdeth. We don't know what he's referring to. What is it that restrained the coming of this man of sin, the son of perdition, that would hold himself up as God, exalt himself above all that is called God, and he would call himself God? You see, the Pope carries about him on his mitre these words, Lord God the Pope. And he's done this for centuries. But he said, what is going to restrain this apostasy, this terrible departure from overwhelming the church and destroying it? Well, Jesus said the gates of hell won't prevail against it. I will restrain. Whether he used angels or his spirit, we're not told. He said, now ye know what withholdeth or restrains, that he might be revealed in his time, in due time. For the mystery of iniquity doth already work. You see, at the time of the writing of this, the mystery of iniquity was working. That was 52 or 53 A.D. Only he who now letteth, and it comes from the word that means permits, only he who now permitteth until he be taken out of the way. So God put a restraining power, so this man of sin, the son of perdition, that would call himself God, would be worshipped as God, that would sit in the temple as God, came into power. Now you can see what happened. Before there was ever a Catholic church or a man doing this, which is, let's say, effectively with Gregory the Once. Actually, it started earlier than that. We had Leo claiming that he was a pope, or the head of the churches. He didn't call himself pope, meaning the head of the churches, but no one took him seriously. Gregory the First was the first man who exercised this power. And there was a withholding of the progress of this terrible tide of apostasy, both in the east and the west, until the church was stabilized and secured and strong enough that they'd be able to handle this. Because remember, the gates of hell would not prevail against the church. Verse 8, and then shall that wicked one be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the power of his coming. He'll destroy him by the power that comes from his mouth. Verse 9, even him he identifies whose coming is after the working of Satan. Now this man of sin, this one who would sit in the temple of God and act as God, would be after the working of Satan, or the energizing of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, with all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth. You show me the man that loves truth, and regardless of what truth is and what truth teaches, he is devoted to truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I'll show you one that will not easily be carried away in false teaching. If you know where truth is, it's in the good book. If you'll say, I'm going to study Jesus Christ, who's the way, the truth, and the life, and I'm going to study the good book that teaches truth. Jesus said to his apostles, he'll guide you into all truth. They would have the truth, and they wrote the truth. Now, people that have a love for the truth will not be carried away, but he's able to deceive them because they had not the love of the truth, that they might be saved, who had strong delusions, and might be damned who believe not the truth. So there would follow in the centuries that came after this utterance, deceptive teachers, influential men that would lead people from the truth. But before this great monstrous thing arose, he tells us that there would be a restraining hand that would hold that tide of apostasy back until the church was strong enough and secure enough. And then in due time it would grow to great proportions. It's described in Revelation as a great whore, the mother of harlots, also described as Babylon. And then later on, Jesus comes and he destroys the whole of it all. And he talks about this, that the people that had the mark of the beast in their hand and their forehead, and he said they'll be cast in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. This then is a lesson for us to learn. He's telling us that in the latter times there would be a departure from the truth. We have seen history written before it occurred, by way of prophecy, telling and explaining to the early church what would happen in the years that lay ahead of them. In the nights that follow, we'll be looking history squarely in the face, and we're going to see arise most surprising things. You will find the development of organizations that were premeditated. We'll find the development of other organizations that more or less were the product of their times. We'll learn about the creeds and the creed makers. We'll learn about the doctrinal systems. We'll also learn about those structures that now categorize, whether it be the Episcopalian form of government or if it be the Catholic form of government. They have unique structures that mark them as separate from the others. We'll find the fusing together of some and the splintering of others. Many people have said, why do you not bring this church history chart to date? And I seriously considered that. You know, things are happening in our day so fast with mergers and splintering of new groups. There is almost no way of determining where you ought to place them on the chart. 10 years, history will change. But basically we have simply graphically told what has happened in the past 1900 years. Aren't you glad that Jesus said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it? We have a song in our songbook, number 324, that tells us of a faith of our fathers, living still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. 324, let's stand and sing. Faith of our fathers, living still, spite of dungeon, fire, and sword. Oh, how our hearts beat high with joy whenever we hear will.